In November of 2004, Blizzard Entertainment unleashed the World of Warcraft upon an unsuspecting world, and the MMORPG genre would never be the same. What began as a polished and casual-friendly evolution exploded into this cultural colossus. By 2008, it commanded 12 million subscribers, which was more than the population of many nations. It became more than a game, and more of this second home, except without another premium currency in order to buy items for the home. Its accessibility, its stylized art that aged gracefully, intuitive questing, and overall a very polished experience made it the undisputed king. However, this crown would also paint a bullseye on Blizzard's back, as every major publisher saw the same dollar signs, and they dreamed of dethroning the Titan. Whether claimed by these developers themselves or by their fervent fans, the term WoW killer became the industry's most seductive buzzword, and so the question became, if Blizzard could bottle lightning, why not them? And so, over the next 2 decades, a parade of challengers armed with billion-dollar IPs and revolutionary mechanics and marketing budgets that rivaled Hollywood marched forth to claim the throne. Each was promised to be the one, and each, in the end, learned the same lesson. In today's video, we cover the story of these would-be usurpers, the games that dared to dream, and to be crowned the new king of the MMORPG. But I guess those scrubs should have learned how to code. Unfortunately for them, that the premier backend web development learning platform, boot.dev, had failed to exist yet. Much like the MMORPG, learning back-end development can sometimes feel like an endless grind. And as much as the world first 300 fishermen, world first Bloodsoul Admiral, rank 14 monotonous Adonis loves that, what if I told you that there's a way to make it as fun and as engaging as a video game? With boot.dev, you can learn back-end web development in Python and Go while feeling like you're leveling up like in an RPG. It's designed to keep you engaged using techniques from game design, and you're actually writing code from day one, solving challenges, shipping projects. Plus, it's self-paced, so you can learn when it suits you. As you complete challenges, you'll earn XP, levels, and achievements, all while preparing for a real-world career in back-end development. And if you ever get stuck, they have an active Discord community, as well as an AI guide boot to walk you through any tricky concepts. If you're interested, click the link in the description and use my code to get 25% off your first month, or even your entire first year if you go for the annual plan. But anyways, back to the video. Before we begin, since we do have quite a number of contestants to go through, I'll have to keep each criminally brief, which can feel like a disservice to fans of these games, but I think in the future I would like to cover them all more in depth, one by one, than what you see here. And saying that just because they failed to take down one of the most popular video games of all time as people predicted or hoped, it doesn't mean that they were or are necessarily bad. Even if they aren't as massive as people would have hoped, many of them are still running today, and they're great games in their own right, and I'll try my best to do each of them justice. With that being said, we'll be going in chronological order, starting with The Lord of the Rings Online. Developed by Turbine and released on April 24th, 2007. The Burning Crusade is a few months old, and World of Warcraft at this point has firmly established themselves as the dominant MMORPG. And here comes one of the most popular nerd fantasy IPs ever made. It was a match made in heaven. You have this IP that's worshipped by nerds, debuting in what is possibly the nerdiest genre of game possible. And during the breakout of the genre, where it was reaching these new levels of popularity and breaking records every single day, it was a regular old nerdgasm. Lord of the Rings Online, or LOTRO as it's referred to, tapped into one of the most iconic fantasy franchises ever created, and one that was also recently revitalized by Peter Jackson's film trilogy. It promised an immersive digital playground for fans craving to explore the Shire, or battle orcs in Moria, or even join the Fellowship's narrative. Beta testers flooded blogs and forums with glowing reports and praising its faithful adaptation to Tolkien's lore. Reviewers highlighted interesting systems like the deed system, which were achievement-like tasks that rewarded exploration, combat, and role-playing, as well as providing stat-boosting traits that allowed for some form of character customization. There's also a unique PvP mode where players could temporarily switch to controlling the realm's evil creatures, and in particular, the game's story-driven quests felt more narrative-rich than World of Warcraft's kind of grindy equivalent, which in turn would draw in more role players and lore enthusiasts. So even though the Burning Crusade was pushing the game to new levels of popularity, many saw LATRO as the next big thing, thus labeling it the first serious WoW killer. They looked at it as this refined evolution of the MMORPG formula that could lure away dissatisfied players tied to Azeroth's more lightweight and cartoonish style. The marketing leaned quite heavily on the IP's popularity, teasing this living world where players could influence the events tied to the Lord of the Rings timeline and interacting with its iconic heroes, which was a very alluring draw and a nice match for the genre itself. And so, pre-orders surged, and the initial sales were quite strong, with estimates suggesting that hundreds of thousands of subscribers would be its peak, and notably, unlike many other MMO releases at the time, the launch was relatively stable. Yet, despite this initial fervor, LATRO ultimately failed to unseat World of Warcraft, and it ended up settling into a respectable, but still niche existence. And this was partly due to the game itself and just due to World of Warcraft's overwhelming popularity, as in this point in time there were over 8 million subscribers. It just simply proved to be insurmountable, as Blizzard's game had already captured the mainstream with its accessibility and addictive loop and broad appeal. While LATRO certainly had its strengths, for many it really just boiled down to the gameplay and the combat, simply lacking the extreme amount of polish that World of Warcraft had. It just didn't feel as reactive and fun. The graphics at the time were quite impressive and detailed, but because of this they were also more demanding, which created issues with accessibility that World of Warcraft was able to overcome with its sort of cartoonish but still efficient graphics that ran smoothly even on modest hardware. A key factor for its widespread adoption is people weren't really interested in paying $1,000 to $2,000 for a computer before they could even start playing an MMO. Many felt that marketing had its shortcomings, as they felt like they relied too much on the Lord of the Rings brand and failed to really promote the actual gameplay and innovations that the MMO itself held, assuming that the IP's fame would suffice. And on the other side, Blizzard at this point were pouring a lot of resources into expansions and community engagement, such as their own personal convention, BlizzCon, to name just one. The endgame, though it was innovative in spots, lacked World of Warcraft's depth and polish and replayability, which would cause retention drops after the initial honeymoon and players hit the max level. By the year 2010, declining numbers had forced a shift into the free-to-play model, which was often seen as the death sentence of the MMO genre. The game's focus on lore and immersion appealed to quite a dedicated fan base, but it just wasn't able to capitalize beyond that. It wasn't bad by any means, and it still isn't bad to this day. Unlike some of the games in this list that you'll see, it didn't have this catastrophic launch or a fundamentally flawed, unfixable gameplay design that doomed it before it even hit store shelves. It was just very similar to World of Warcraft in its setting, structure of this theme park, linear MMORPG that attempted all of the things that World of Warcraft perfected, but not quite being able to reach its level, which just left many players feeling like they were playing an inferior, less populated version of what was then the cultural phenomenon World of Warcraft. And it was because of this that it was mostly the hardcore fans of the IP who were the ones that stuck around. Today it still endures as a beloved cult classic, and it continues to get updates and expansions and introducing more content to keep things fresh, and it's quite loved by those who play it, and for good reason, even bearing witness to modern attempts failing before they even release. Shoutouts to Amazon.
What now, my lord?
Now we sound the bells of war.
In 2005, Funcom announced their stake into the MMO genre with The Age of Conan: Hyborian Adventures, developed by Funcom and published by Eidos. The game drew from Robert E. Howard's iconic Conan the Barbarian universe, promising a gritty and mature fantasy world that contrasted sharply with World of Warcraft's more whimsical tone. Its key features, perhaps the main one being, was its innovative real-time combat system. Instead of the standard tab targeting that most other MMOs relied on, Age of Conan's was in real time with no auto attack, but instead requiring button presses to swing in 3 different directions and having to physically hit enemies with your weapon if you're playing a melee character. There was also the guard system, where enemies would devote defense to either of these 3 points of attack, preventing the spamming of one direction, and adding a strategy element where players would have to try to work around their defenses, or alternatively, dodging away in order to avoid some damage. You could weave attacks together to create smooth combos and finish fights with brutal decapitations straight out of Mortal Kombat. All of this was marketed to be revolutionary compared to the usual tab targeting system, and it would be the main thing that the game would stake its claim on, as if it were the adult version of the genre and everything else was kiddie by comparison. Going further, it fully embraced mature themes and M-rated content, including nudity, gore, and profanity to appeal to an adult audience tired of the rather sanitized entries being offered within the genre. It touted voice-acted quests with strong narrative depth, over 800 in total, solo dungeons, immersive storytelling with 12 unique classes to choose from, and massive zones to explore, endgame raids to conquer, and PvP elements like massive sieges and guild cities promised large-scale warfare. The class system itself was interesting, focusing more on a hybrid style. There were 4 main archetypes, soldiers being the frontline fighters, rogues for the more agile-based DPS, mages for ranged spellcasting, and priests for healers. As mentioned, there were 12 in total, with a lot of them being hybrids, such as the Bear Shaman, which is a melee fighter, but also heals. Industry Buzz positioned it as the next evolution, like with many of the entries that you'll see in this video, with beta testers praising its hybrid classes and visceral gameplay. The hype for Age of Conan was absolutely unreal, earning rewards upon rewards for pre-release screening at conventions, and its initial sales reflected this fervor, nearing 1 million copies and drawing a very large player base eager for a fresh, skill-based alternative to World of Warcraft. And looking back today, for many, this particular period of time is sort of representative of the MMO Gold Rush's pinnacle, and where the term WoW killer was really being thrown around quite a lot. However, Age of Conan unfortunately crumbled under its own ambitions.
So this is what happens whenever it locks up.
The launch was a disaster, as they had rushed to beat other competitors such as Warhammer Online, which was on the horizon. It ended up shipping incomplete, with polished content only up to level 20 to 30, and after that many dead spots between quests that forced tedious grinding, and the game as a whole becoming progressively more and more buggy and clearly unfinished further than that. Bugs, server instability, and high system requirements caused lag and crashes. In its first week, it had a huge memory leak issue, which required players to manually delete a file every 5 minutes during gameplay, or else they would suffer a crash. Not quite what the players had in mind with its so-called interactive combat. And outside of combat, the crafting system in particular was a mess, barely passing as functional for the features that were implemented, with many others promised, such as the guild structure building, being absent during the launch, leaving a large portion of the player base unserved and disappointed. The graphics in particular would really become one of its biggest hurdles. We mentioned this as a problem for the Lord of the Rings Online section, but for Age of Conan it was much harsher. As promised, the graphics were absolutely stunning for its time, and the sheer scale of the world and how much you could see at any given time was truly impressive. However, it also severely gatekeeped the player base, as few had machines that were powerful enough to run it smoothly, leading to choppy frames and a very poor experience. As someone who played it personally during its launch, to get over 20 frames a second, I remember having to have the camera constantly facing the ground. This poor performance was especially bad because of this new interactive combat system. It demanded much more agency compared to the classic tab targeting, because you had to react to enemies putting their guard up and defenses, and putting yours up and trying to string combos together. So It was much trickier when you're getting like 10 frames a second. So for a very large portion of the player base, it turned what should have been this innovative experience into a rather frustrating one. As for the endgame, it was quite disappointing early on. As mentioned, the structure building was absent at launch, and the PvP stages were delayed by uneven leveling between the game's races, and similar to the Lord of the Rings Online, while the endgame PvE was there, it simply didn't feel as polished as World of Warcraft's, which now even had a few years of experience under their belts. All of this led to rapid attrition. The population halved within the first month and dropped to around 200,000 by month 2. World of Warcraft's impending Wrath of the Lich King expansion, which ended up being a peak of the game, rapidly drew players back, as Blizzard's polished updates outshone Funcom's mismanagement, including post-launch layoffs and delayed fixes. It wasn't long after release that Age of Conan's co-founder would quit, citing dissatisfaction with the project, as subscriptions continued to tumble until 2011, where it too would convert to the dreaded free-to-play model, signaling defeat. In retrospect, Age of Conan's innovative features and intense graphical capability ended up being undermined by execution flaws, and unluckily World of Warcraft's continued success, proving that raw power alone can't top a cultural phenomenon, and serving as just one of many MMOs released during this era that hamstrung itself by releasing far too early. Today, it barely clings to life, despite the fact that there have been no official updates in over 5 years, serving as a depressing yet intriguing example of what was once a highly anticipated world, now forgotten and seemingly abandoned. 2008 truly did represent the gold rush within the genre, as it was also then is when Warhammer Online, The Age of Reckoning, would also see its release. Riding off the wave of immense hype as one of the most anticipated MMORPGs of its era, it was often touted as the legitimate WoW killer this time, for sure. Developed by Mythic Entertainment, creators of the PvP-focused Dark Age of Camelot, and published by Electronic Arts, it leveraged the rich and gritty Warhammer fantasy universe from Games Workshop, promising a world of perpetual conflict between the forces of order and destruction. The game's core innovation, and possibly its most advertised feature, was its Realm versus Realm system, featuring massive-scale PvP battles, objective-driven scenarios, and dynamic campaigns where players could invade enemy territories and sack capital cities, creating a sense of this real, gritty, ongoing war. A lot of excitement was generated with video blogs from the creative director, Paul Barnett, where he had developer diaries showcasing concept art, gameplay, and promotional events. As usual, online communities and media outlets buzzed with predictions of it dethroning World of Warcraft, citing not only its RVR focus, but also its innovative public quest system, which were open-world events where players collaborated without grouping, and also a class system blending archetypes like the warrior priest for hybrid roles. As the Warhammer universe predated Warcraft, it was quite clear that the latter took a lot of inspiration from it, meaning that these two worlds were very similar to each other, which made direct comparisons inevitable. Initial sales reflected the fervor, with 1.2 million copies sold by late September, with 800,000 registered users and 750,000 active players by October, primarily drawing in PvP enthusiasts eager for a fresh alternative to the world of Azeroth. But, as history would show, despite the strong start, Warhammer Online rapidly declined. Positive reviews highlighted exciting PvP, but the game's heavy emphasis on it alienated casual players who World of Warcraft had excelled in serving at this point, and offering a far superior leveling campaign, as well as a rich PvE endgame. Like Age of Conan, it too suffered issues at launch, with many believing that it was released prematurely. Too many initial servers led to fragmented populations as the initial surge started to wane, which caused deserted realms and subsequent merges that frustrated communities. Poor faction balance was an issue, and it hamstrung their most enticing feature, their RVR, as battles quickly became lopsided and unfun for both sides. They also suffered controversies outside of the game, such as players being erroneously billed for multiple years of subscription fees in a single day. Subscribers quickly plummeted to 300,000 by December of 2008, which prompted further server reductions from dozens to just 13, and later on just 3 worldwide. With the game waning, EA's influence began to become more powerful as they started to divert resources to other projects, which resulted in minimal post-launch support that failed to address core flaws as content updates slowed to a crawl. And all the while, World of Warcraft was going strong with what is considered today to be its highest quality expansion. As financial losses started to pile up for EA, Warhammer Online's fate would be sealed, with the Games Workshop license expiring in 2013, leading to its shutdown. It was a game that had plenty of innovative systems. In fact, many of them would later be essentially lifted by World of Warcraft itself, and its failure for many today is more of a reflection of a rushed launch with destructive influence from its publisher, as well as poor timing as it was pitted against World of Warcraft during the worst possible moment. A fan-run server, The Return of Reckoning, keeps its spirit alive today, providing a home for die-hard fans. And if you are interested in more detail of its rise and fall, this is one of the MMOs that I did actually cover fully in its own dedicated video, which I'll have linked in the description.
You assumed no force could challenge you. And now, finally, we have returned.
For our next entry, similar to The Lord of the Rings, we take what is quite possibly the nerdiest genre of game and combine it with what is quite possibly the nerdiest IP in existence. Star Wars: The Old Republic. Coming off the back of the failed Star Wars Galaxies, The Old Republic was the IP's second attempt at breaking into the then bustling genre, bringing with it one of the largest development budgets in MMO history, estimated between $200 and $300 million, positioning it as the ultimate WoW killer, for sure this time. Developed this time by BioWare, who are then renowned for their narrative masterpieces like The Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect, and it was published by... The Old Republic promised to revolutionize the genre by making every player feel as if they were in the Star Wars universe with their own fully voiced cinematic story set 3,600 years before the films. The game's 8 class campaigns, each with branching dialogue, moral choices, and companion relationships, were fully voice acted by Hollywood talents such as Jennifer Hale and Steve Blum, delivering a single-player RPG experience within this MMO shell. Features like flashpoints, which were instant group content, space combat, faction-based PvP war zones added variety, while at the same time the Old Republic era allowing creative freedom unbound by the film canon. Critics and fans praised the storytelling, with some calling it the best story-driven MMO ever made at that point, and it was all backed by John Williams-inspired orchestral scores. Forums overflowed with excitement, predicting that this time for sure it would finally dethrone World of Warcraft, especially since it was set to release during a rather rare moment during World of Warcraft's legacy, where for the first time it had shown signs of weakness with the Cataclysm expansion. So unlike Warhammer or Age of Conan, it had the correct timing to strike. Marketing was absolutely huge and commanded a sizable percentage of its massive budget. CGI trailers that rivaled World of Warcraft racked up millions of views as pre-orders exceeded 1 million, and after the game launched, over 2 million players logged in during the first week, which shattered records for the fastest-selling MMO, excluding expansion packs. Yet, despite this explosive launch, the Old Republic failed to sustain this momentum, and it never seriously threatened World of Warcraft. The core issue was structural. One of their biggest sells, the fully narrated campaign, was front-loaded in the leveling, which left players empty-handed upon reaching the max level, as the game sort of awkwardly transitioned into a more traditional, repetitive MMO, with the standard daily quests and gear treadmills, which felt jarring and hollow without the narrative glue that made the leveling shine. This problem was made worse with the fact that max level content in general was lacking in quality or missing entirely, as evidence of yet another rushed release started to show. And infamously, another structural problem was the engine that they used was a modified version of the Hero engine, which ended up being unfit with an MMO setting as it struggled in all corners of the game. There's quite a noticeable delay between using an ability or spell and that spell actually connecting, an issue that they tried to mask with fluid animations, but still it left the core combat of the game feel rather clunky and unresponsive, which just left players wanting to return to the finely tuned and polished experience that World of Warcraft offered. Many lamented that the world failed to capture the vastness that the Star Wars universe was capable of, as most of the areas in the game were instanced, which in comparison to World of Warcraft lacked seamless, explorable continents without the interruption of a loading screen. For many, it just didn't really feel like a world, let alone a universe. So they unfortunately didn't achieve their goal of giving the players this feeling that they were actually living in the Star Wars universe, which, ironically enough, was something that its failed predecessor, Star Wars Galaxies, did quite well. It felt quite restrictive in a lot of ways. Even the highly anticipated space combat, where people imagined this wing commander-like experience of soaring around the planets in these intense classic Star Wars dogfights, left fans disappointed when they found out that it was entirely on rails. Instance Battlegrounds, in order to keep the queue times low, initially pitted maximum level characters against low levels, and scaling the latter's stats up to accommodate for the discrepancy. However, this did little to help, as low-level players still lacked their full toolkit. It is comparable, for instance, in World of Warcraft having this level 60 rogue versus a scaled-up level 10 rogue. You can give them even health and damage, but if the level 10 only has Sinister Strike and Gouge, it's not really going to be a fair fight. So because of this, the victor 9 times out of 10 was simply the side that had more true max level characters. This was later rectified partially, as the maximum levels were wisely given their own queues, but it was a substantial amount of time after its critical launch period, so many got fed up and left before ever seeing it fixed. And outside of the battlegrounds, its heavily advertised open world zone, Ilum, was also mostly unplayable due to its large scope, which caused performance issues, as well as design flaws, as it was initially more beneficial to win trade rather than actually participating. By mid-2012, millions of voices cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced when subscriptions plummeted from 1.7 million to under 500,000, eventually forcing the dreaded free-to-play shift with restrictive caps and predatory cash shops that alienated players. BioWare's inexperience with live service MMOs showed. The updates were slow, bug fixes were delayed, and promised features like the ranked war zones arrived late. The game was and continues to be great at drawing in players who enjoy their more single-player experiences, such as the legendary Knights of the Old Republic. But once that ended and transitioned into a normal MMO, its flaws started to become very clear, proving that even the Star Wars IP and BioWare's storytelling magic couldn't overcome the genre's demand for this endless, evolving, and well-designed systems and content. Today, its identity remains to be this story-driven title, and it certainly serves those players well, and they overall seem to be pretty happy with it, but its 2011 promise as World of Warcraft's destroyer remains to be one of the industry's most expensive, unfulfilled prophecies. Moreover, although the term WoW killer was and is still used many years later, it was after the Old Republic that people began to really lose trust in that term, as the grave that was meant to be filled with Blizzard's giant was now overfilling with those who sought to succeed it. While this term was largely used by the individual players of the genre, the next entry on the list actually made ads about it, and that's Rift in 2011, which was themed around this dynamic world where planar rifts tore open spontaneously, spawning invasions that demanded server-wide cooperation to repel. Developed by Trion Worlds and powered by a custom engine, the game promised to evolve the theme park formula with reactive events. These rifts would escalate into zone-wide wars if ignored, and they would trigger boss spawns and drop powerful loot, as well as serving as a way to level up to break the monotony of the standard MMO questing. The marketing was pretty direct, using the tagline, "You're not an Azeroth anymore." And it was fairly effective, with pre-orders topping 500,000 and over 1 million accounts activated within the first month. Not quite as intense as previous entries, but still quite notable. Beta weekend saw queues of 10,000 plus as players marveled at their crown jewel, which was their class system consisting of 4 callings, the warrior, cleric, mage, and rogue, with 8 souls each, which were sort of like subclasses. You could mix and match 3 of them, which allowed for hybrids, such as the fan-favorite Chloromancer healer, who damaged enemies to restore allies. You could unlock more of these souls by questing, which gave players a lot of room to experiment, and it was really targeting World of Warcraft refugees who didn't really care for its rather rigid class system. Exploration would also be a key selling point. Hidden items called artifacts were spread throughout the world, which could be traded for vanity items, encouraging players to go off the beaten path and explore every corner of the rich world that they were advertising. As for the actual launch and introduction experience, it was uncharacteristically smooth for an MMO. The players jumped in, conquered rifts, built their own unique classes, and explored the nooks and crannies of the world, and they did the standard gameplay of what was expected of an MMO, giving players a very familiar experience. That sounds all well and good, but unfortunately, this is what would prevent it from overtaking World of Warcraft. Rift suffered the same fate of some of the others in this list. It wasn't really bad by any means. It was just another MMO that didn't really have enough innovation to overtake the genre, as it left players with an extremely familiar, yet unremarkable experience. The dynamic Rift events, which the game was named after, couldn't escape the fate that all MMOs face. If you do something enough times, i.e. hundreds, it will eventually become repetitive. They ended up being less innovative than players had hoped, with some even labeling them as a rehash of Warhammer Online's public quest system. They spawned on timers, followed scripts, and the loot tables incentivized farming the same footholds repeatedly, which undermined this ever-changing alive world that they were banking on. Again, it's not to say that they were bad, just not as game-changing as players had hoped that they would be. Probably its best feature was its class system. As players adventured throughout the world and they unlocked more and more souls, as promised, it gave them a lot of agency and power to create their own unique builds. It did end up suffering that age-old problem that every MMO faces. Choice can oftentimes be an illusion, as there's always a best. There's always some sort of meta that gets established, so while it may have had the capability to have all of these different combinations, oftentimes, especially with social media being what it was at this point, most people just fell into a few different builds. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it was a very unique system that served nearly every single playstyle that the genre had to offer, and it was rare for people to not vibe with at least something. Unfortunately for them, though, it simply ended up not being enough, and despite its rare, smooth launch, it was just too familiar and derivative for players. Server populations fragmented across 30 plus realms, which led to its own host of issues such as mergers, which further fractured what remained of communities as subscribers waned from reportedly 1 million active in 2011 to under 100,000 by 2014. Like many others, today it does still linger on. It was sold to another company called Gamago, where it has subsequently stagnated. Now a free-to-play relic, remembered mainly for briefly making the online world standard to the MMO feel alive again. That is, before the rifts were closed and Azeroth called players back home, contrary to its advertising tagline.
Now is the time. Claim your destiny. Forge your legend.
The next entry on our list is quite unique because it isn't dead or reduced to this very niche audience. It's in fact found a pretty respectable player base, and it's carved out its own foothold within the genre, and that's Guild Wars 2, released in August of 2012 Developed by the veterans ArenaNet, Guild Wars 2 promised a living, breathing world that would put their first installment to shame. It aimed to stray away from the vertical style of progression that World of Warcraft had standardized, where resets were infrequent and investment mattered many years after it was made. The combat would be its first innovation, blending a combination of tab targeting and action-style elements that rewarded those who stayed mobile and dodged enemy attacks, while at the same time fluidly weaving in their attack rotation. The class system was unique. Boldly, they had aimed to break the Holy Trinity tank healer DPS combo that was now standard in the genre, offering classes with high customizability and loadouts, as players could mix and match abilities and create their own hybrid builds. And reminiscent in some ways of Warhammer Online, their world versus world system was also a big draw, pairing your server against two others in a giant, large-scale battle for territory control. Groups and guilds would band together to capture keeps and castles in these massive sieges, or find small skirmishes in the fields between them. Both this game mode and its normal PvP would also scale players' levels up to be even with one another, which made it very accessible and easy to get into, and make you feel like you're always contributing, as well as keeping the battles relatively even. Another main feature, and players from Rift and Warhammer Online would recognize this, was the event system, where, similar to those games, what are called events would pop up in the world for players to complete. Although it wasn't the most innovative feature at the time, it did add some dynamic replayability and also spiced up the often grindy nature of the leveling in MMOs, as well as adding a bit of social play at the same time. So this, combined with the massive cooperative PvP mode, it aimed to make the game feel very cooperative and reward team play. Leveling was also unique in the sense that every action provided experience. Instead of questing, you could mine, create items, or complete achievements and challenges, which gave the player a lot of power to divert from the standard run-of-the-mill questing experience. It was quite attractive for those who preferred the less combat-oriented elements of the genre. And all of this without a subscription fee. While there is a big stigma against free-to-play games in the genre, it wasn't completely free, as it launched with a payment model of purchasing the base game and also expansions, but foregoing the monthly payment in order to appeal to a broader audience that didn't want to commit so much to it. And so the game launched, and this is normally where I describe where things went horribly wrong, but it really didn't. It wasn't perfect by any means. It suffered some launch issues as any other MMO would, but things weren't so bad as to scare away the bulk of their player base like some other games in this video. It had a solid endgame, both PvE and PvP. The classes didn't feel restrictive and gave players a lot of freedom for experimentation. The combat was smooth and fun. It has arguably the best flight system in the entire genre, with World of Warcraft essentially lifting it in their Dragonflight expansion. And to top it all off, its focus on horizontal progression ensures that the time that players invest into the game retains a good amount of its value compared to many other games within the genre. Like everything else in this list, it failed to kill World of Warcraft, but it never really tried to. The sheer excitement surrounding it positioned it as the genre's future, but it was never marketed as a WoW killer such as with Rift. In fact, ArenaNet themselves even said that they didn't want to compete directly with World of Warcraft, as they were trying to make something different, which they succeeded at, as today, the game for many is a good representative of what a quality horizontal progression MMO should be, and it continues to get expansions and updates, and continues to be a worthy and reliable source of fun for its players. There exist many IPs of varying genres that players feel would make great choices for a reimagining in the MMO setting. At a certain point, one of the most popular was the world of Elder Scrolls by Bethesda, instead of being caught in the shackles of a single-player campaign-driven experience. What if the world of Tamriel was shared by players, with the classic quests featured in the leveling campaign, and the endgame to be this classic, large-scale, group-oriented content? ZeniMax Online Studios would promise just that with the unveiling of The Elder Scrolls Online. At this point, Skyrim had released just 3 years earlier, and it sold over 30 million copies. quickly reinforcing that it was a staple of the open-world fantasy RPG genre. But now, Bethesda had handed the keys to its most sacred franchise to a studio led by Matt Fuhrer, who is the architect of the Dark Age of Camelot. The vision, as was standard with the genre, was ambitious to say the least. Players would explore every province from High Rock to Black Marsh and wage war in 3-faction PvP, steal from merchants, murder innocents, join the Dark Brotherhood or the Mages Guild. Pretty much everything that made the Elder Scrolls this legendary sandbox, but now amplified by the presence of other players. Cinematic trailers amassed millions of views, pre-orders began to fly off the shelves, and as usual, fans anointed ESO as the new heir before it even launched. By launch day itself, which was April 4th, 2014, they had 1.3 million pre-orders secured. At that point, quite a serious challenge to Blizzard's upcoming Warlords of Draenor expansion, because importantly, it would come at a time of great stagnation, as the end of the Mists of Pandaria had one of the longest content droughts in the game's history. People were bored. The identity and theme of Mists was a big miss for many of its players, and the Elder Scrolls Online looked more like World of Warcraft than World of Warcraft did itself at this point, while subscriptions were tumbling, and the stage couldn't be set more perfectly for a new king of the MMO. But since it's in this video, something obviously went wrong, and while it wouldn't be fair to say that it's a bad game, it just wasn't all as great as people imagined it would be. The most overpowering feedback that people will tell you is that while they wanted Elder Scrolls and they wanted an MMO, instead of these two forces complementing each other in this smooth and enjoyable experience, they actually ended up getting in each other's way, and it just turned out to be a poor Elder Scrolls experience and a rather mediocre MMO, where quests felt important and had weight in the single-player games, as is standard with most MMOs due to the sheer amount required to reach the max level. In ESO, they felt diluted, mundane, and unimportant, and lacking the level of polish and depth and narrative that the series had become iconic for. And importantly, due to its sandbox nature and its associated freedom, you really often created your own story and chose your own direction. However, since ESO is an MMO, a rather linear one at that, everyone is given this predetermined direction, and therefore it lacks one of the series' greatest strengths. The series defines itself on the lone hero overcoming these impossible situations, swaying kings, slaying others, slaying dragons, and making the player feel like they're this major, impactful figure within the world, and that just isn't possible in a multiplayer setting. Another large issue for many was its core, the combat. The combat in Skyrim, while not perfect, was smooth, punchy, responsive, and fun. Swinging a sword or warhammer felt like it had weight, and flinging spells felt satisfying and immersive. That is, if you don't count pausing the game in order to ingest 40 cheese wheels.
This is a tasty burger.
And in ESO, while not as polished, it does have some of the same flashes, as it's all in real time. Wisely, they did avoid the tab targeting system, and they stuck with the more appropriate real-time kind of hybrid. But when people criticize the combat in ESO, oftentimes they just say that it felt flat and boring. And the reason for that isn't really due to the actual combat, but more by the fact that in 95% of the game's content, and for the entirety of the questing campaign, it just lacked any agency because everything was too easy. It had the Lost Ark syndrome. Another game, speaking strictly the leveling campaign here, was laughably boring because 95% of the encounters ended within 5 seconds of starting them. It was so easy that it didn't keep players engaged. If we're speaking strictly MMOs here, it's rather common for most of the challenge to be held at the end game, whereas questing serves as an introduction to prepare you for that end game. If every single enemy were challenging, it would be quite laborious to kill thousands upon thousands of them during your leveling campaign. But again, the whole idea of ESO was to draw in fans of Elder Scrolls, a community of people who were used to and expected a smooth, engaging, polished, and at least somewhat challenging combat experience. And while it certainly had potential, it just didn't really live up to it, and it made other systems feel worse, such as their class system, which banked on high customization and experimenting, which is great by itself. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much because you could essentially roll your face on the keyboard and achieve the same outcome. Again, discounting the endgame where there is some challenge to be found, experimenting was meaningless because any combination resulted in success, no matter how ridiculous it may have been. Level scaling was an issue. When the game first came out, it followed the World of Warcraft style of enemies in a zone having a certain level. So if you're level 10 and you try to go to a level 20 zone, you would get destroyed pretty quickly, which again was against the identity of what made Elder Scrolls great. One of its main draws is that it's this huge open world with many different things to do and different directions to go, and you're given a lot of power in the order in which to do them. And so the developers took on this feedback and they changed it such that the enemies now scaled with the player's level, which gave more freedom. However, on the other hand, it made it feel less like an RPG. This was something that World of Warcraft struggled with in the Legion expansion when they did essentially the same thing. One of the core pillars of the RPG genre is feeling like you're progressing, encountering an enemy or a boss, struggling, gaining a few levels, and then coming back and making it your bitch. This is the satisfying core pillar of nearly every RPG ever made, but if everything now scales with you, it's completely lost, and numbers become just that. Numbers. You do more numbers, but the enemy has higher numbers, therefore you've not progressed, which put into question the point of levels to begin with, as they've now become this arbitrary carrot to chase. Another disappointing thing was that thief characters shipped without any meaningful thievery system. Sneaking around and pickpocketing is core to the franchise and extremely impactful in the single-player games, with players able to get 5-finger discounts on immediately useful or valuable endgame items, weapons, and armor. However, in an MMO setting, it had to be restricted because it would be way too powerful to loot items that actually had major value or impact, as it would break the core gameplay and economy. No one would run dungeons or raids or grind crafting if you could simply steal something equivalent from a weapon shop in the city, so they were limited to food, low-level items, or other inconsequential, mostly useless junk, along with a daily limit of the amount of stolen items that you could sell, again, all because of the restrictions of its multiplayer setting. In trying to serve both fans of the Elder Scrolls series and fans of the MMORPG genre, they ended up failing both, at least in its initial period. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. Similar to Rift, it was just okay, and okay wasn't enough to keep players hooked in any major way in what was then a very oversaturated genre. All of this, combined with controversies such as locking access to the most popular race, the Imperials, to a more expensive special edition, severely hindered that critical launch period, which is a shame because the game today, most agree, has improved drastically since its launch. It still releases expansions, and it has a respectable audience, and who knows what the future may hold, but these limitations were certainly enough to keep it from impacting World of Warcraft in a major way, even during what many consider to be one of its most vulnerable periods. At this point, it had started to set in with people that World of Warcraft was here to stay. But wait a second. What about an MMO that was developed by none other than Blizzard? WildStar is the next entry on our list, a game whose development team consisted of former World of Warcraft developers under the name Carbine Studios. A big pitch for the game was that although several developers were from Blizzard, they wanted to form its own identity based around the fact that it wasn't World of Warcraft, and it didn't want to fall into the same fatiguing clone market that had been oversaturating the genre for years at this point. They would try to achieve this in many ways, even going as far as to creating its own engine to cater to their needs. Set on the planet Nexus, it pitched a very colorful aesthetic with a brutal endgame, which was based around their telegraphed combat system. Like some of the others in this list, they decided to forgo the tab targeting system and went for more of this real-time reactionary-based combat, where projectiles and swings must be physically dodged or aimed in order to land, which provided much more agency and generally requiring far more coordination. Of course, with such a system, the movement had to be quite fluid, and players would be given a variety of tools to make both the combat and exploration feel fun and fair, such as dodge rolls and double jumps. There was a particularly large focus on difficulty and grinding, with raids that required pixel-perfect coordination and attunement trials that were locked behind lengthy grinding, trying to appeal to a very hardcore audience. As grindy as it was, they aimed to mix things up by using a unique leveling system called paths, where upon character creation, players could choose any of the 4 choices of the explorer, soldier, settler, and scientist, and these would give different experiences during the leveling based around whatever they picked. PvP was a big focus, particularly their war plot system, which were very large-scale 40 vs 40 sieges that took place on battlefields crafted by the players themselves, aiming to ensure that each was a unique experience. And player housing was an exciting feature for many, where players could buy these different plots of land and customize their own home to the finest detail, whether that be the house itself, its decor, or even the yard outside, as well as including actual gameplay features such as crafting, gathering, and even dungeons to run. And particularly because the development team consisted of former vanilla World of Warcraft developers, many had aspirations that they would be able to bottle lightning twice and finally be the one to dethrone their own creation. But its identity was far different, to say the least. World of Warcraft at this point had firmly entrenched in what was initially marketed as the MMO for the casual player, introducing many layers of accessibility at every corner. And while this served its casual audience, a portion of their hardcore players argued that it was done at the expense of the game's overall quality. And so WildStar targeted these jaded veterans, promising salvation. There'd be no LFR mode, no welfare epics, no handouts, just skill, commitment, and accomplishment. But anyone who knows the fate of WildStar knows that this, of course, wouldn't last. MMO launches are filled with all types of players, casuals included, and having defined themselves as the antithesis of casual, this audience would quickly fade in the face of this insurmountable challenge and grind. So much so that many today even pin the blame on them, focusing primarily on this hardcore audience. The questing, as described, was incredibly grindy and arduous, and even then, when the max level was reached and players started getting into raiding, they were hit with this brick wall. The attunement process requiring high performance in dungeons, world bosses, reputation grinds, locked 95% of the players out of the raids, and by September 14th, only 2% had stepped into the first raid. And where it promised difficulty, boy did it deliver. The very few who actually made it to the raids were met with some of the most challenging content the genre had ever seen. Everything functioned as it was intended. The fights were quite creative, and the custom engine really shined by implementing this fluid movement in order to handle the mechanics, but they were also brutally punishing, and exhaustion would set in quick, with bosses even being buffed as time went on. This was speculated by some to add longevity to the game, in that the endgame content wasn't fully finished, as the content drought hit pretty hard. The launch also suffered from some general hiccups that was standard in the MMO. Their war plots lagging into unplayability, as well as their auction house crashing daily. Speaking of war plots, they suffered from some queue issues, as it was difficult to get 80 players to join at the same time, and the PvP in these battles was pretty troublesome and degraded into chaotic clusterfucks. The problem with this telegraph system is that when PvP skirmishes got to a certain size, your screen would just become garbled with a mess of flashing red and players scrambling like chickens with their heads cut off, resulting in little strategy and a lot of rolling your face on the keyboard, spamming as many AoEs as humanly possible. I want you to tell me, what in the holy mother of God is going on here? Oh yeah, just dodge the red, bro. Come on, just dodge it. And so server populations hemorrhaged from 20 plus realms at launch to 2 by 2015. They attempted a relaunch in September of the same year, but it didn't see much success, unfortunately. Carbine would lay off 70% of its staff in 2016, and NCSoft officially shuttered the studio in 2019, and WildStar is chronicled as yet another MMO that failed to stay alive, let alone topple World of Warcraft. And many today cite WildStar specifically in arguments between serving hardcore and casual audiences, with many concluding that at the very least, an MMO can't survive on the hardcore audience alone. And while challenging endgame content is certainly important to the genre, it can't be the sole focus, and every area of the game must have some level of polish to retain every type of player. Last on our list, we have what is arguably the king of the RPG genre, Final Fantasy. Coming off its successful launch of Final Fantasy XI in 2002. In 2009, players would learn that the 14th installment would also be developed on the massively multiplayer scale. It promised another reinvention. Perhaps the biggest innovation was the class system, where players could switch between jobs on a single character, with the jobs themselves reminiscent of fan favorites of the series, such as the Black Mage, the Summoner, Paladin, which was quite unique compared to World of Warcraft's traditional system of locking players to one class on character creation. Developers promised a very heavy focus on lore and story, and retaining the charm of the single-player experiences. They said that they wanted this living story that was updated every 3 months, with adventures' actions shaping the fate of the world, as well as their fellow players. The combat blended 11's deliberate pacing with real-time ability queuing, and the world was a love letter to the series, with primals like Ifrit and Titan manifested as these giant colossi. It would have player housing via housing wards, player orchestras, as well as the Golden Saucer to serve as side activities, promising a bright and active future, and fans were quite optimistic from the success of 11, declaring that 2010 to be the year that the East would finally topple Blizzard. Everything was looking pretty good, and then the game launched. And the dream was shattered, as it ended up sucking what was perhaps the biggest dick in MMORPG history. The original Final Fantasy XIV, now retroactively dubbed version 1.0, was a catastrophe of historic proportion. The first thing that players would notice was its incredibly poorly designed interface, which was an indecipherable labyrinth of menus nested within menus, almost representing a series of puzzles to solve to even obtain the most basic information on how to play. Every menu had a submenu, every submenu had a submenu, and getting critical information such as item durability, stats, or even things like buying and selling items was unnecessarily irritating. Even one of their most touted features, which was changing jobs, was incredibly awkward and time-consuming, as your character would repeatedly phase in and out of existence as it equipped different pieces of gear. The game initially had no auction house, instead using the player market feature, where players could set up vendors, but it had no interface to search items, so instead you'd have to investigate each vendor one by one, all the while trudging through menus and submenus, and then another submenu, only to find out that the only thing being sold are copper ore and pickles for a ridiculous price. Getting into the bread and butter of the game, the questing was quite monotonous. The world was copy-pasted terrain stretched for miles with little to no points of interest, and quests that required players to travel 20 minutes across empty plains to kill 3 ladybugs. There were no mounts nor fast travel systems initially present, aside from this teleportation system that lets you teleport to previously visited areas. However, this would cost a currency called anima, which was quite scarce, and most people would burn through it rather quickly. And while this does have some benefits, such as making the world seem large and imposing, since the zones were largely empty and dull, it wasn't really as rewarding as they had intended. They did follow through with some promises. There was story to be had with quite impressive in-game cutscenes, but they were delivered in milestones with long stretches of generic, tedious MMO questing injected in between them. And what's worse was that you couldn't even go at your own pace, as the game limited the amount of quests that you could complete, putting you on something of a daily timer before you could actually continue the story. The idea was that in the meantime, to force you to either grind mobs or more efficiently help other players with their quests that you've already completed, therefore encouraging social interaction. Although some would say that the word encouraging is rather generous, and it really was just awkwardly restricting the player. And speaking of restrictions, even experience per job would eventually become capped, again to encourage people to switch between them and diversify their character. So between this and the severely limited methods of travel and the questing limitation, it really kind of betrayed one of its biggest marketed features, which was this freedom to do what you want to do. The graphics were fairly good. They were also quite demanding. Similar to some other games on this list, they had the problem of having this high barrier of entry in order for it to be playable smoothly, and even then it was poorly optimized, with even those having the most powerful machines suffering crashes and frame stuttering, which made things like combat even more clunky than it already was. Yeah, the interface wasn't the only awkward thing about the game. It just felt awkward, slow, and sluggish. It was difficult to target mobs. Spells and abilities would randomly lag or fail to function, and enemies' health would randomly regenerate to full for no reason. It was clear that this core part of every MMORPG had received little to no polish. In other words, it was a mess. It was so bad that Square Enix actually issued a formal apology for how terrible it was, which was unprecedented within the genre's history, and they vowed to essentially remake the game from the ground up, which they eventually did in 2014, titling it A Realm Reborn. The interface was fixed, the combat was ditched entirely, travel options were improved, story quests were refined, as well as the class system, and it actually became a great MMORPG, with many citing it as one of the greatest redemption arcs within gaming history. It's a rather linear theme park style of MMO, but with a ton of side content to explore, and the game really shines in its story for most players. It hit something of a peak around the year 2020 with its Shadowbringers expansion and then into Endwalker, at which point the World of Warcraft had released what is regarded today as their worst expansion ever, the Shadowlands. Both within that expansion itself and the culture surrounding Blizzard as a whole contributed to something that the genre was very unfamiliar with. World of Warcraft was no longer the clear winner, although it is impossible to tell as neither MMO releases official subscription numbers, but some third-party analytics and data suggested that it was at least close, as players had begun to quit Shadowlands en masse and sort of migrated to Final Fantasy XIV. And to this day, that's the closest that any MMO has ever been to being labeled as a WoW killer. And so concludes our coverage. Like I said, due to the amount of games in this video, I had to criminally underreport on some of them. I do want to say that failing to take down one of the most popular cultural phenomenons isn't really a statement on their quality. Many of the games listed here were and are successful in their own right, and a lot of their issues aren't even their own fault, especially in the cases of just bad timing on their release, or perhaps their publishers influencing them in negative ways. I think in the future I would like to cover these individually to give them the more proper respect that they deserve. It could be a fun little mini-series for the channel, so let me know if you'd like to see that. Aside from that, I hope you enjoyed the video. Like it if you liked it, because I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.